Just to get a head start on people who would like to call me racist, sexist, homophobic, allow me to say some things right up front. Okay, I would rather live in a city with a large gay population because gay people make for a more vibrant city. More art, better food, more fun. And no, I'm not gay. And no, what I'm saying isn't, I'm not stereotyping gay people. Like I've heard people, I've said to people, uh, I think that gay people tend to be more creative and intelligent than straight people. And the gay people said, no, that's a stereotype. You can't say that about gay people. They're just like everybody else. So, that's just a weird thing. And it's also wrong because a lot of cities now understand that if you want to have a city that's dynamic and is working well and that attracts the right kind of talent, it's good to have a lot of gay people around because they make for more vibrant cities. If you look into it, you'll see that that's true. Anyway, uh, I love multicultural environments, and I think it is my duty to be patient and friendly to newcomers, enough to, for example, try and learn a few basic phrases in languages such as Hindi. I do, I do this. Um, I don't think that the immigration numbers are suitable or rational or good for the country, um, but I don't set those targets, and my responsibility is to be a nice guy, and I try to be that way, and I think that I am. I get along with immigrants to Canada very well, and I deal with them all the time. Um, the thing is that, to be perfectly honest, in the area where I live, I prefer immigrants to white people because so many of the white people in the neighborhood where I live are struggling with, well, drug addiction, poverty, homelessness. Um, they don't have families, they're not married, and all of those kinds of things, which is a product of, the feminism and the sexual revolution and that sort of thing. And they're just screwed up. I can see it all the time. White people seem to me to be screwed up, which doesn't necessarily mean I don't like them, but for sure they're embarrassing. I mean, it happens to me a lot that I go out, and a lot of the time I go out, I'm pretty much the only white person there, and the other white people that are there are, a disaster. They're scary. It's embarrassing. I feel sorry for them, but it's what happened to them. So, you know, I'm just being honest. Uh, okay, sorry. I lived in Asia for over 20 years and married to a Chinese woman and deliberately chose to live in one of the most diverse neighborhoods in Canada. I love it, but I'm not so naive as to think it does not come with serious risks, especially when politicians exploiting the anxieties of immigrants by demonizing Canadians as racist and holding themselves up as protectors. Okay, I'm sorry, that's going to interrupt myself again. One thing that I've noticed about Trudeau is that he doesn't seem to be particularly intelligent. And one of the ways that he's not intelligent is he doesn't seem to pick up on his own mistakes. So he'll make a grammar mistake, a pronunciation mistake, a word choice mistake. He doesn't seem to notice, and he just moves forward. So I don't want to do that here. And I think I may have. Um, I lived in Asia for 20 years and married to a Chinese woman and deliberately chose to live in one of the most diverse neighborhoods in Canada. I love it, but I'm not so naive as to think it does not come with serious risks, especially when politicians exploit the anxieties of immigrants by demonizing Canadians as racist and holding themselves up as protectors. Um, this is really the crux of it. Because what happens if the immigrants to Canada are actually convinced by all these messages, about how horrible we are with colonization and how racist we are? You know how dangerous it would be in the area that I would live if the hatred that these wokies are trying to provoke actually found a place in the hearts of my neighbors? It would be dangerous. And sorry, wokies, they're not digging it either. So that's my impression. And I've had a bit of uh, discussion about that, trust me. um, I love it, but I'm not so naive as to think it does not come with serious risks, especially when politicians exploit the anxieties of immigrants by demonizing Canadians as racist and holding themselves up as protectors. That's what Trudeau's trying to do. He's trying to pit immigrants against people who were born here. They hurt immigrants as much as Canadians with their hate and fear mongering. Meanwhile, European Canadians are becoming minorities in their own cities, being disparaged for being racist and having every past misbehavior dug up and shoved in their faces. It makes me think of the situation in Japan. Japan treated a lot of other Asian countries really badly during World War II, and I'm just imagining how the Japanese would react if they suddenly had a lot of Chinese and Koreans and Malaysians, I believe, that they treated abysmally. If they suddenly were living almost as minorities around Chinese and Koreans, etc., and that their government was constantly berating them for their past. I mean, that's just inconceivable. They would go berserk. And so would people in a lot of countries. Canada is the most open country in the world, and England's colonization of Canada amongst the most gentle in history. I think that the money that England borrowed to fight the slave trade was only paid off, I think, in 2005, or it was in this century that they finally paid off the debt for that. British and American men did more to end slavery than any other group of people on the face of the earth. That's just the fact of history. It's the kind of fact that isn't shared. They don't share the fact that Muslims took probably 2 or 3 million Europeans as slaves, and quite often as sex slaves. It's not mentioned. We have paid out billions in compensation and made numerous official apologies. At some point, for the sake of the country, the grievances need to become much less frequent, but will not because they're way too lucrative. You get what you pay for. We're paying for these race baiters, so more race baiters is what you're going to get. And they need to pursue it for the benefit of their career. Okay. So I'm just going to scroll down a bit. Okay, sorry. Forgive me, I'm all over the place, I know, but please allow me to switch gears a bit. This is something people are angry about. Limiting Limiting the development of Canada's oil and gas sector has done almost nothing but ensure that less ethical countries with lower environmental standards produce more of it. We could have used taxes on oil revenues to build a more sustainable country, reduced our own reliance on fossil fuels, and helped Asian countries move away from coal and towards natural gas. I mean, they're really disappointed with us. They're breathing lousy air over there, in part because Canada wouldn't come up with the natural gas that they were guaranteed we could have sold them. So just think about what we've done. In January of 2023, the Japanese Prime Minister came to Canada looking to replace Russian gas. Trudeau had this to say: "We know that being a reliable supplier of energy is important, and we're going to look for ways to be that reliable source of energy," he said. "We know the world is moving aggressively, meaningfully towards decarbonization, towards diversifying, and this is in the current environment, right? With oil and gas prices the way that they are. With people suffering, they're having a difficult time running their societies, and he's talking about, I guess he's talking about they're going to go to solar and wind or whatever. I don't know what he thinks is going to happen. When Germany came with similar requests, Trudeau said he would try to help out, but was especially excited to talk about helping Germany with its hydrogen aspirations way down the road. Okay, and that's in the current moment. Germany came to him saying, "We need your energy. Can you ramp it up as quickly as you can right now because of the difficulties they're facing?" And that's what he said. Let's face it, the man is an idiot. The trucker convoy was about all this and more. Let's list off in point form the things that make people justifiably angry and baffled. Okay, the divisiveness. He complains about people sowing divisiveness while simultaneously doing it himself. That kind of thing is gaslighting. He does it a lot and he enjoys the sadism of it. That's honestly my opinion. Okay, uh, things we're angry about: the corruption of journalists, efforts to censor free speech, corruption scandals like the Aga Khan debacle, SNC Lavalin. He fired Jody Wilson-Raybould for standing up for the rule of law. We Charity, the India trip, Bill 51 prevents an accused in sexual assault from obtaining a fair trial. Barbara Kay has written quite a lot about that. Bill C-51 prevents the accused in a sexual assault case from getting a fair trial. It's just one of the basics that they've violated. You have the right to a fair trial. Okay, to continue. Sunny ways, ladies and gentlemen, sunny ways. Roxham Road. How many times did you visit the ethics commissioner? How much did you pay McKinsey? It was about $120 billion. And that group was responsible for helping cause the opioid crisis in the United States. It helped the Saudis arrest political dissidents in Saudi Arabia. What do you mention happened to them? They interfered in elections, and way back in the 50s. They were working with big tobacco. He would have known all of this. Here's something people don't complain about: the bromance with Obama while the wives looked on. I don't know if you remember when Obama visited and they made such a big deal out of the bromance that they had with one another. And you could see that Michelle Obama and Sophie Gregoire were uncomfortable. So if you say that, oh yeah, I'm great with gay rights and all of that, does that mean that I have to put up with that kind of behavior? I don't think so. Just go and look at it. So people will say, well, no, they weren't really doing that, right? Well, then why didn't they just call it a friendship? The things that make us angry: the new anti-Islamophobia representative, Amir Elgo Habawabe, sorry for butchering the pronunciation. It's something we have to learn how to pronounce a bunch of different names in different languages, which is educational, but, it is a bit of a task. Who said Canada Day was a celebration of Judeo-Christian values, as if love and forgiveness is a bad thing. She wants to drop the monarchy, does not understand Quebec secularism laws, and called Quebecers Islamophobes. Okay, so the problem with that, if you say that Canada Day is a celebration of Judeo-Christian values, and you don't understand secularism, you don't understand Western culture, because Western culture is Judeo-Christian, and it is about the way that the Western world escaped from under the control of the church. And that's what the Quebec secularism law is about. That's what Western culture is. It's based on Judeo-Christian values, but it's overlaid with the Enlightenment, where we learn to understand that while the Bible might be filled with a lot of wisdom, it is not the source of knowledge about physical reality, which kicked off the scientific revolution, which brought the world to where it is today. Apparently she doesn't understand that. That's a big problem. Okay, here's another thing that irritated us. See, there's an example where I caught my pronunciation mistake and corrected it. Trudeau doesn't do that. And I'm sorry about that too, this bumbly way I talk. Okay, amongst the things that are irritating to us, we have recently switched to drinking water bottles out of water. That's a really good one. We have recently switched to drinking water bottles. And not just with drinking water bottles, but drinking water bottles out of water. When we have water bottles, out of plastic, away from plastic towards paper, like drink box, water bottle sort of thing. Who am I to complain about that, right? I do the same thing myself. But the problem is, he never made the least effort to reduce his use of plastic or any other thing. That's why the question stumbled him so much. Never made the least effort to reduce his use of plastic or any other thing, including jet fuel. And he was surprised as bought and paid for media asked him a tough question. Or maybe they didn't think it was a tough question. Maybe they were going to give him an opportunity to explain what he had done himself. It's the hypocrisy that people can't stand in all of this. Amongst the other things that have made us irritated, the ArriveCan app, the mess at Canadian airports and Canadian service offices, the mess at immigration, the glowing eulogy written for Fidel Castro, the "my favorite country is China" comment, the hundreds of thousands of business closes due to pandemic restrictions. Good grief already. This is just the way I've written it. Okay, so changing gears a little again, I guess. Everything inside the state, nothing out the state. That is the communist motto. It explains why they attempt to destroy everything that allows people to live freely. Traditional marriage, the church, national pride, and the democratic principles that protect fundamental human rights such as free speech, violated by cancel culture constantly. And the examples of that are just astounding. A person, just one little slip, and he's in for 2 weeks of, what did they call it in China? Well, you go and they try to reprogram your mind. They'll make you say things that you don't believe. And it's really difficult for people to do that. And so eventually, because they can't bear the contradiction of thinking one thing and saying the other, they've got a choice, don't they? They can either quit saying that thing and lose their job, or they can start to think the thing that they don't believe. And that's what happens. It's a gross violation of the human mind. Equality of opportunity, violated by die principles. Property rights, violated by excessive taxation. Parental rights, violated by the gender ideology taught in schools. These principles are what protect us from the government. I think that maybe what we've lost is this idea that we need to be protected from the government, and that's what a lot of these fundamental human rights are about. The government can't violate those, and they do. When it comes to the trucker protest, it is probably the case that most of the protesters were male. Let's take a look at what has happened to them over the last 50 years. And changes in the workplace. As our society mechanizes, the skill set required by many employers favors women's ability to interact with other people, frequently in the ways that involve multitasking, something women seem to be naturally better at. That is a simple observation, and certainly not a criticism of anyone. I mean, I go out and I see women working, and I'm astounded, what they can do. Men are more suited to tasks, generally speaking, not all, to tasks that require a great deal of focus. And women are better at multitasking. And so they do well in management positions. So men's ability to earn a living has been compromised in the last 50 years. Throughout their school years, boys are taught as if they were girls for the simple reason that girls' learning styles makes the teacher's job easier. Many of those boys are coming from homes with no role model and no male teachers, and the female teachers are woke ideologues who are biased against males. A large study was done in which the names on essays were changed from male to female, and it was found that essays with girls' names on them were given a higher roll score consistently. And there was a massive study on this done before. And what they did was they just changed the names on essays from a white-sounding name to a black-sounding name, and they consistently got worse scores. So there was racism. I think that was a long time ago. These days, they'd get a higher score. If all that the teacher knew was that this guy was Henry Jones and this guy was, I don't know, black-sounding name, they'd get a higher score. No, it's changed. But And that research was important. I mean, people held that up as an example of why this teacher's clearly racist. Um, but when they do a similar thing and it comes out that they're clearly racist, or I'm sorry, sexist towards boys, well, nobody notices. Um, so the discrimination that boys face in school perhaps explains why so few boys are making it into university to study subjects such as medicine, law, education. And these professions are already dominated by females, particularly education and medicine, and increasingly law. It surely can't be new to anyone that girls, and women for that matter, are praised and encouraged continually. They're also the beneficiaries of affirmative action programs, especially if they want to study STEM subjects, despite the fact that that women are already a clear majority in almost all universities. Divorce courts have been incredibly brutal to men in ways that predictably hurt children because they make it difficult for them to see their fathers. Like girls, boys now struggle with a very strange environment where pornography is readily available, where half the kids are growing up with mothers and or fathers, whatever. Say what you like about the sexual revolution. It sure did screw up a lot of kids. To top it off, men's testosterone levels have been dropping by 1% a year for, I think, 50 years. That's a big deal. Testosterone gives men confidence and pleasure in that confidence. It is a real tragedy that this seems destined to continue, and so few people even talk about it, let alone try to reverse it. Um, there were a lot of programs. This was in New York City, designed to reduce the violence of men, mostly, I would imagine. So I had this program and that program. And what happened was they took the lead out of gasoline, and suddenly the rates of violence just plummeted. And what they realized was that, the programs may or may not have been beneficial, uh, but what had caused the improvement in behavior was that they'd taken the lead out of the gasoline. And I think that that's true too, because something I'll admit is that men are a lot better behaved than they were when I was a kid, except for the ones that are just extremely angry all the time. And there's a lot of them. There's a lot of really angry men. They're baffled and confused, they're bitter, angry, they're walking around. And you can kind of understand why. Um, but rates of violence, rape, and all that kind of thing are way down, and it's probably in part due to the drop in testosterone. The problem is that it's bad, really bad for a man's health and self-concept. The list of ways that this society disenfranchises men is long, but your patience, I understand, may not be. I hope that I have at least given some sense of men's concerns. If you want to see an example of how hostile universities can be to women, uh, can be to men, I'm sorry. If you want to see an example of how hostile universities can be to men, you might want to check out the YouTube video of a feminist protesting Warren Farrell's talk about the various crises facing men. It is harrowing. Seriously, Warren Farrell at UBC, you should see how they responded to him. And what Warren Farrell wanted to talk about is the things that I just mentioned. There's a boy crisis. It's for real. And he wanted to talk about it at UBC, and he had been a prominent feminist. And then he started to realize that feminism was causing a lot of damage to everybody, really, and included that in his thinking. And as soon as they did that, the reaction was just brutal, absolutely brutal. The way that those women behaved was sickening. Warren Farrell protest at UBC, just check it out. Jordan Peterson and Janice Fiamengo have faced similar protests. These are the kinds of things people are angry about, as well as this. These kids, after the lockdowns, we already knew, higher rates of depression and anxiety and sadness, he said. But what we didn't know was whether their brains had changed. And their brains had changed. Until now, these sorts of accelerated changes in brain age have appeared only in children who have experienced chronic adversity, for example, from violence, neglect, or family dysfunction. That's according to researchers. Should name the researchers. That's Nicole Lin Chung at Euronews.next. Kids that came out of the lockdowns with brain damage. Uh, okay, I can recall when saying that woke authoritarianism was a real threat. I think maybe I've mentioned this before, and just thinking that I was crazy. Can this actually be possible? But just a couple of days ago, speaking on C11, the censorship bill, a Canadian senator said this: "This law will be one of scapegoating all those who do not fit into what our bureaucrats think Canada should be. Stalin will again be looking over our shoulder when we write it." It's becoming more and more often that it's the case that people are pointing out the connection between what's happening in most of the Western world now, especially Canada. Canada's a real basket case, I think, and comparing it to what Stalin did. Last night it was Bill Maher was comparing woke ideology, woke fanaticism to what happened during the Cultural Revolution in China. And I don't think that Bill Maher is a rabid right-winger. Sadly, Canada is famous around the world right now for electing a narcissistic, condescending, corrupt, woke authoritarian creep for a prime minister. If that seems unlikely to anyone, it could only be because they do not watch independent news outlets and personalities like GB News, Russell Brand, and in Canada, Jordan Peterson. In the United States, the Dark Horse podcast, Dave Rubin. In Canada again, This Guy's Garage, Clyde Do Something, Gad Sad, and Janice Fiamingo. There are loads of extremely successful YouTube channels dedicated to pointing out woke authoritarianism. It's a growth industry. And I really get the feeling that some people are living as though they're not aware of what's been happening now for, 5-10 years, I guess. They can feel the presence of this thing. It scares them and baffles them, but they never, invest the energy. And a lot of us have invested, hundreds, if not thousands of hours into studying this stuff. I have. Surely no one could be so arrogant as to imagine that these people are just a bunch of right-wing crazies and white supremacists. One clue to that is that most of them are people who once did, or even strangely enough, would still like to think of themselves as left-leaning liberals. I don't know how they pull that off, but I've heard them say it. I've heard, say Russell Brand, for example, say something like that. Brett Weinstein thought of himself as one until the Evergreen University catastrophe, in which white students were told to leave the campus, and when they didn't, the black students seized the campus. Likewise, Russell Brand. He is as blatantly hippy-dippy as you could get. He's also wickedly intelligent, articulate, and passionate, and at some point started to notice that left-wing antics were becoming a serious problem. I mean, is it difficult? Look at what Antifa did to Portland, say, for example. Just look at what Antifa did to Portland. BLM, biggest tragedy to hit the black population, especially with the defund the police movements in, I don't know, really a long time. That was the biggest tragedy for the black community since, I would say since slavery. Janice Fingo was a feminist until she became a faculty member in a feminist studies program and was appalled by the poor scholarship that she found there. And a lot of them are gay. Douglas Murray just comes off the top of my head, Dave Rubin. Maybe I shouldn't say a lot, but enough. Like when I go to the trucker protests in Vancouver, well, it's Vancouver. There's a lot of gay people there. Look at this quote from Tulsi Gabbard. We have the autocratic leader in Canada who's resorted to genuinely authoritarian and tyrannical means to suppress a peaceful mass protest against the power elite there. That's Tulsi Gabbard talking about Justin Trudeau's invocation of the Emergencies Act. Tulsi Gabbard is not a right-wing white supremacist. She's a Democrat. And she's female, and she may even be not white, not entirely white person. How about this? A new report by Britain's Oxfam International found that Canadian billionaires saw their wealth grow by a staggering 51% since the pandemic. So in 2 years, they made $500 million. That's from the Toronto Sun. You certainly can't blame people for being suspicious about that. How about this one? Under your quasi-liberal boot in recent months, we watched how you trample women with horses, how you block the bank accounts of single parents so that they can't even pay their children's education and medicine, that they can't pay utilities, mortgages for their homes. That was a Croatian member of the European Parliament. Yeah, I don't know if people realize that, but the European Parliament got it put together a meeting to decide what to do about the Ukraine-Russia situation, and 3 different members stood up and called him a dictator. People say, oh yeah, they were right-wing guys. Okay, yeah. How about this one then? Will Canadian democracy survive Justin Trudeau? That's the title of a Wall Street Journal article. Mr. Trudeau, you are a disgrace for any democracy. That's a German member of Parliament, Christine Anderson. So get this. It's long been an article of faith that objectivity and impartiality are cornerstones of responsible journalism. But more and more people, including many journalists, are questioning the sanctity of objectivity, especially when the arbiters of what's objective truth and what's opinion are largely the mostly white, mostly male people who run most newsrooms. Really? I mean, there's so much wrapped up in that. That's from a CBC article. Okay, in my opinion, the CBC could serve a useful purpose in a polarized world, because so much of the news now, like Fox News was the one that started it. They just, okay, we're going to forget being objective. We're just going to just hammer home our point of view. And then the left had to do it, I guess. But in a world where there's so much polarization, what the CBC could do, but won't, because we're such a crazy country, is strive for objectivity. Put on some people like Bjorn Lomborg, who has a different perspective on global warming. Douglas Murray a little while ago did an interview with a guy who wrote a book, I think, The Case for Colonization. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that people understand that the people who benefit from colonization frequently are the people who are colonized. And that's because the colonizers tend to come with better technologies. And the people who are colonized benefit from that. And a lot of did. Hong Kong wouldn't be what it is now. Singapore wouldn't be what it is. India wouldn't be what it is without that. Because Britain brought the idea of the rule of law, property rights, and all of the rest of it that went along with it. And which isn't to say that they didn't do horrendous things, but they did fewer horrendous things than any other colonizer in the history of the world. I mean, if you listen to the CBC, you'd never learn anything like that. Here's a good one. The trucker convoy is an insult to memory and truth. That's Justin Trudeau. To which I just have to respond this way. No, Trudeau, you are an insult to memory and truth. I mean, Canada's going to have to deal with the history of this idiot. And we'll be talking about him for a long time. Here's one. We need to find the people who won't identify as feminists and deal with them. That's Justin Trudeau. So the question is that, how far would they go? If you say that a government is authoritarian, then you mean that they're going to violate people's human rights. And just how far will they go? They're willing to violate the right to equality of opportunity. They're willing to violate the right to freedom of speech. So how long does it take, since they are headed in that direction, before they start moving towards, imprisonment, torture, and murder? People dislike authoritarian regimes for a reason. Here's an interesting quote. It's the Freedom Convoy Code of Conduct. In the event of violence or threat of violence, disengage and inform an officer. Be kind and respectful towards your fellow Canadians and international supporters. We're working with authorities to help ensure public safety. We ask that all individuals be on their best behavior while spreading the message of unity, love, and forgiveness. The Canada Unity Freedom Convoy condemns all hate symbols. Individuals who are expressing messages of hate and division are not members of the Bear Hug movement. However, Trudeau apparently calculated that it would benefit himself and his party to be dangerously divisive, a sure sign that you're dealing with an authoritarian, which he could do because the truckers had been successfully demonized in the mainstream press and the truckers had a lot of support. That is a recipe for serious conflict, which I contend he wanted because it would justify a repressive reaction that would be satisfying to his base. He must have known that the truckers were not, as he called them, a fringe minority. They had raised $20 million in 2 weeks and could have raised more, most of it in small donations from working class people, some of whom had their bank accounts frozen ultimately. The Freedom Convoy was the longest convoy protest in the history of the world and was attended much of the way by people shouting encouragement from overpasses and roadsides and in the middle of winter. That takes a lot of commitment. Is it even possible that he and his party could not have known how much support they had? I think not. A leader who was interested in healing the country would have listened and compromised rather than ignore and insult, especially as it was becoming clear at that point that the lockdowns and mandates were problematic. Pfizer made more annual profit than has ever been earned by any company in history, or so many have suggested. $100 billion profit. That buys a lot of influence. Not only did Pfizer and Moderna have a mandate to vaccinate the entire planet, they could do so without liability. That's the way that it was written up. We'll see about that. These are the sorts of things that the truckers felt righteous in opposing, which is simultaneously a brilliant and a dangerous thing. A sense of righteousness in the face of injustice can be extremely motivating, and when kinships of like-minded people form to fight an injustice, they can do a lot of good. Unfortunately, this kind of kinship and motivation can also lead to tremendous harm, as we saw in relation to the George Floyd incident and the rise of BLM and the defund the police movement, which did more to set back the lives of low-income black people than any other event in decades. Moral: don't do things that cause groups to feel righteous in opposing you, especially if you're a politician, because it may well lead to catastrophe. To critics of the movement, it may come as a surprise that the truckers and their supporters felt righteous and exhilarated that we're finally doing something to oppose unreasonable COVID measures and the divisive authoritarian liberal government. Authoritarianism is humanity's default position. Democracy cannot be maintained without sacrifice and struggle. The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots. Let's hope it has not come to the yet, as this kind of thing can only happen in revolutions, and revolutionary leaders are just as frequently worse than the regime they replace. I'm afraid of the anger that this stuff is causing on the right. They're getting scary. I admit, I agree. At some point you have to stop fighting. And one thing that might help people stop fighting is a public broadcaster that was dealing rationally with both sides of the issue. That would be one step that they could take. They could do something brilliant. And they won't. Anyway, the truckers provided a good example of how we might avoid such a thing by resolutely sticking to the principle of nonviolence. When the CCP wanted to gain access to the Taiwanese media space, 600,000 Taiwanese took to the street with the message, "When dictatorship is a reality, revolution is a responsibility." The truckers were living up to that responsibility in general, but let's face it, the horn honking was clearly excessive beyond the first day or two and clearly wrong. The horn honking and the border blocks are the only real stains on the movement. I'm going to break rank and say that, in my opinion, violent is not such a bad way to describe some of the honking that went on. That created real hardship. Violence, even if it isn't literal, defeats the purpose of any just protest. Fortunately, though, there was not a lot of violence of literal sort, and that is a big part of the reasoning for saying that the invocation was unjustified. The protesters engaged in almost no physical violence. Still, it's not difficult to imagine that the truckers' presence could have felt intimidating to the dear citizens of Ottawa. A lot of those guys were big and no doubt loud. Beyond the first day, the honking was a very bad thing to do. It hurt the cause. Apologies are due, as is some form of compensation. Not the 300 million being sought by the citizens of Ottawa, obviously, but certainly a substantial sum is due. But, and this is a great big but, the truckers did a billion times more good for the country than bad. Trudeau is famous around the world for being a creepy authoritarian. We went from being perceived as passive subjects of a woke weirdo dictatorship to champions of good sense and better governance. That was Canada in the eyes of much of the world, especially in the independent media, which now competes aggressively and effectively with traditional mainstream media. We were heroes in the independent media, probably still are. Due in part to these protests, you're going to see more and more lawyers, doctors, and public intellectuals argue the truckers' point of view that lockdowns and mandates, by that point, were doing more harm than good in a lot of ways. Okay, so now we're in a situation where my freedom of speech has been limited because if I say what I want to say right now, my channel will be deleted, and I think that I would be banned. The truckers demonstrated the way to behave in the face of intimidation, and that's by remaining peaceful. So far, Trudeau, his provocative behavior, and his attack press haven't gotten the violent response they were going for, not even when they went after hunting rifles. Non-violence is our greatest strength. Let's remember that. These next few quotes are pretty well known by now. They don't believe in science and progress, and are often misogynistic and racist. It's a small group of people, but that doesn't shy away from the fact that they take up some space. This leads us as a leader and as a country to make a choice. Do we tolerate these people? Okay, so you're wondering just how far he would go. Would he imprison people? Well, he says that they're taking up space. Interesting fact, the Emergencies Act was written to prevent the sorts of abuses carried out by his father using the War Measures Act. Anyway, you have to wonder what not tolerating these people would entail. He would definitely censor, which for people who like to comment on political affairs or anything else, can be a real hell. Would he restrict their ability to travel, gain employment, or attendance in universities? Certainly, and so would a great many people. Cancel culture is a real phenomenon. They're currently attempting to strip Jordan Peterson of his license to practice psychology because of his social media posts that were critical of Justin Trudeau and the excessive COVID lockdowns. It's assuming that they were excessive. I'm not saying that they were excessive, okay? I'm not saying that. But I am saying that a lot of people thought they were. The new fascists will be the anti-fascists. That's Winston Churchill. While a controversial figure, both Mr. Castro's supporters and detractors recognized his tremendous dedication and love for the Cuban people, who had a deep and long-lasting affection for El Comandante. That's Justin Trudeau. My favorite country is China for the basic dictatorship. As famous as that line is, I wonder how many understand just how sadistic and murderous that dictatorship was and still is. The elder Trudeau had a soft spot as well. Once asked if he would turn Canada into a communist country, he answered that yes, he would, but he did not think Canada would allow it. Perhaps they'll allow it now. Reminds you of the song, doesn't it? Perhaps they'll allow it now. Just for laughs. One sometimes get the impression that the mere words socialism and communism draw towards them with magnetic force every fruit juice drinker, nudist, sandal wearer, sex maniac, Quaker, nature cure quack, pacifist, and feminist in England. And that little ditty was written by none other than the great George Orwell. And George Orwell was a communist. George Orwell was a communist until he saw what communists were like. Uh, Jordan Peterson was with the NDP, and his line is that he realized that they didn't love the working class so much. A lot of them thought of themselves as intellectuals, so they didn't love the working class. They just hated the rich. She reminds me of the joke. I'm not a vegetarian because I love vegetables. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm not a vegetarian because I love animals. I just hate vegetables. And something that people are starting to understand is that, or think, and in some cases I think might actually be true, is that environmentalists don't love nature so much. They just hate humanity. That's what people are saying. The truckers were right to protest Trudeau. Okay, I could get in trouble here. And there's no pause function. So I have to scroll and talk. Jump around a bit. The committee that designed the mandates in Canada included not one epidemiologist. And even if there had been, it is not the role of government to allow one group of experts to determine national policy. It is their job to consult with economists and business leaders, for example, sociologists. In this case, they should have consulted with sociologists and psychologists, as well given the social and psychological impacts that mandates and lockdowns would entail. They should have asked psychologists, what's that going to do? You're locking everybody up in their house for that amount of time. What's it going to do to their health? They also should have been consulting with the general public, not consulting with professionals and not consulting with professionals on that. Asking psychologists, what is it going to do to people's mental state, locking them in the house? Not talking to economists, asking, what's this going to do to the economy? And saying that you're going to trust the science and you're just going to listen to the epidemiologists, and then not hire one epidemiologist to sit on the board that designed the lockdowns and mandates. I mean, how berserk can you get, really? A lot of the time people are looking at what they do and they get dizzy. I've seen this so many times. They'll be describing this kind of situation and suddenly they just go blank. They've been fire hosed with this stuff for so long that it just knocks the stuffing out of people. Not consulting with professionals was cruel and an abdication of responsibility, much as we have seen with regard to the opioid epidemic. But in this case, they do talk to the professionals, one kind of professional, the drug counselor types. Anyone with a speck of sense could have told them that their current approach with regard to harm reduction and the current approach to dealing with heroin addiction is just sucking more and more people into the madness of drug addiction. The broader community that has to contend with the resultant homelessness, encampments, and street crime should talk to us, right? The people making these decisions don't live in rough neighborhoods, do they? I do. It certainly doesn't do much to instill confidence in their ability to handle COVID or any other epidemic. When citizens criticized Trudeau's incompetence, cruelty, both characteristic of authoritarianism, he reacted with his most authoritarian measure yet. And in response to the most justified protest in Canadian history, the biggest, we made history and will be very well remembered for it. At no point in Canadian history was it ever necessary to put together a protest against an authoritarian government. That never happened before. This is a bizarre episode in Canadian history. If Justice Rouleau comes out with an unreasonable legal decision, that's going to hurt the country. We are not all little Winston Smiths with no other choice but to write history their way. We will write it our way. It will be better than what is written by the side arguing they were justified in doing violence and freezing bank accounts of people who they wanted to scare into submission. Pfizer made $100 billion in 2022 alone. They did it by corrupting universities, media, and government. Here's likely how it worked. Big Pharma pays universities to write studies in a way that flatters them and their interests. And this is another one where I've got personal experience with the way that pharmaceutical companies corrupt medicine. I've seen it. These studies, the studies that flatter Big Pharma form the basis of government policy. Such as lockdowns, mandates, and vaccine purchases, and were eventually used to squash human rights, such as mobility rights, bodily autonomy, informed consent, and freedom of expression. Millions of people were discriminated against in employment and education, and the media played along. In the worst instances, they reported that officials were concerned about ideologically motivated violent extremists and money laundering and terrorism associated with the convoy. That's slander. There was no money laundering and there was no terrorism. Passages like this from City News were common. As the so-called Freedom Convoy enters its 6 weeks of protest, as the so-called Freedom Convoy enters its second week of protests in Ottawa, hard questions are being asked about a GoFundMe campaign set up by convoy organizers and whether any of the 10 million raised so far might have come from malevolent sources keen on wreaking havoc in Canada. Okay, according to Canadian security forces, no such threat existed. And that came out both in the commission and in the committee hearings. Okay. I'm going to do a little quote. The result of consistent and total substitution of lies for factual truth is not that the lie will now be accepted as truth and truth be defamed as a lie, but the sense by which we take our bearings in the real world and the category of truth versus falsehood is among the mental means to this end is being destroyed. Postmodernists don't believe in reality, which means they don't believe in truth. Anyway, that quote came from Anna. I can't figure out how to pronounce her last name. It is Arndt. Before wrapping up for today, I'd like to bring your attention to a couple of news articles that came out recently, both from Canada and both available on the CBC, and both giving video evidence of a truly berserk leftist rage. The tide is turning on their movement. It will be rejected more and more frequently, and their reaction will not be pretty. Many have found a lot of purpose, meaning, and belonging from their woke identities, and surrendering that will be very difficult. Expect a lot of doubling down. Okay, if you want to just see an example of just absolute berserk woke rage, watch Freedom Convoy, smaller, more subdued protests, 1-year anniversary on YouTube. In it, you'll see a stout counter-protester, female, viciously slam a microphone into the face of a man celebrating the 1-year anniversary of the Freedom Convoy in Ottawa. She hit him hard enough probably to break his nose, cut his lips, perhaps even knock out a tooth. But we have no idea because the CBC journalist ignored his plight, I'm really sorry about this, and instead politely interviewed the assailant for her perspective. Seriously, you have to watch it. She viciously smacked him in the face with the microphone. They ignored the victim. and interviewed the assailant. She complained that they were babies or something, and that was that. You really need to watch this. After hitting the man in the face, she paused to observe the pain she had caused before strutting away, only to be interviewed by the CBC. Aside from this incident, both the original protest and the anniversary were remarkably peaceful. That might have been the worst violence that occurred, actually. Next one is another YouTube video called Sid Responds to Flyers Ivan Provov Boycotting Pride Night Program. In it, you will see a sports broadcaster fly into a rage over the fact that a hockey player refused to wear a pride flag. You have to watch the video to get a sense of the barely controlled fury this man felt. But this is what he said. I mean, the guy's just scary. If Ivan had been there, or somebody who had contradicted him had been there, I have no doubt that he would have pounded the living shit out of him. He was infuriated. And this is what he said. I just think the NHL has to do something here. This is not good enough. This is not good enough. Hockey is for everyone, unless you don't agree with gay rights. Is not the phrasing of this. You're either in this or you're not. So this is the in-out mentality that religious people, ideologues, are prone to. You're either with us 100% or you're out. There's no nuance. There's no complexity. So with the pride flag, the thing is that it seems to be obligatory now. Every government regulated industry puts it up. Every school puts it up. The police put it up. And it's a kind of a celebration of sexuality, of a particular kind of sexuality, right? What are we doing it for? What is the purpose of putting that on a police car? What are the police doing celebrating any type of sexuality whatsoever? It just doesn't make any sense. It's, when a conquering force captures a territory, they plant a flag. Anyway, he goes on, he says, nothing scares me more than any human being who says, I'm not doing this because of my religious beliefs. Because when you've looked into people's lives who normally say that publicly, you'd throw up at what you saw. You would throw up at what you saw. And I've seen that a million times in a lot of ways. So don't give me that with respect. Don't give me that because no one's perfect. Don't feed me the religious beliefs line, and all of a sudden the NHL is going to back off this. Yeah. What a night. What he said, if you write it down, read it out, doesn't sound that bad. You have to watch it. Sid responds to Flyers Ivan Provorov boycotting Pride Night program, and his jersey sold out like in a day or something like that. They couldn't produce enough of them, so that gives you an idea of how much resistance there is to this. And I don't know. I don't think that those people are all homophobes. I think that those people are people who just don't want it shoved in your face all the time, like just constantly. What is the point of it? Which isn't to say that I don't think there's homophobes. I'm sure there are, but you're just going to create more by forcing it on everyone all the time. I think I may have done this before, but I want to do it again. In my studies of communist societies, I came to the conclusion that the purpose of communist propaganda was not to persuade or convince, not to inform, but to humiliate. And therefore, the less it corresponded to reality, the better. When people are forced to remain silent, when they're being told the most obvious lies, or even worse, when they are forced to repeat lies themselves, they lose once and for all their sense of probity. I'll admit, I don't know what probity is. Probity. I would imagine something to the effect of identity and self-respect. To assent to obvious lies is in some small way to become evil oneself. One standing to resist anything is thus eroded and even destroyed. A variety of emasculated liars is easy to control, and I think if you examine political correctness, it has the same effect and is intended to. That's from a man named Theodore Dalrymple. Just as an aside, listen to his interview with Jordan Peterson. In it, you will find the argument that if only women could stop having children with bad boy types, and if bad boy types could quit impregnating women who they don't intend to stick around with, in or out of wedlock, prisons and psychiatric hospitals would be practically empty. His reason for believing that? He worked in a psychiatric prison and rarely, if ever, met an inmate who was not the product of that kind of mating. Um, yeah. Uh, I mean, you're looking on the streets. You want to know, why is it so violent? Why is it horrible? So horrible. Well, it's because a lot of these people are coming from really lousy families, wouldn't you think? Anyway, I'm sure it's obvious how relevant these last quotes were. A variety of emasculated liars is easy to control. I think if you examine political correctness, it has the same effect, and it is intended to. So I'm sure that those quotes were obvious. The next few may not be quite as obvious. I think there's a domestic violence lobby in the United States, Canada, and England that have a vested interest in keeping the way things are, with no attention paid to male victims of domestic abuse or the brutality of divorce courts. That's what the topic under consideration was that when I found this quote. And this is really important. I think that there's a domestic violence lobby in the United States, Canada, and England that have a vested interest in keeping things the way they are, both for their career funding and expansion of their territory. It may start with radical feminists, but I don't think the majority of women are radical feminists. There are a few women in positions of power in the legislature and judgeships that have an ideological view that make it very hard to change. That was written by a man who, and I haven't included his name. I'll try to do it in the next one. He knew more about, the guy who said that knows more about domestic violence than anybody in the world. He did a presentation with a woman named Erin Pizzey and Senator Ann Cools. And at the beginning of the presentation, he said, we've got an hour and a half here. I'm going to prove to you that in domestic violence situations, women are as violent as men. They might not do as much damage, but they initiate violence more often. And that if you're going to deal with this situation, you have to deal with the abusiveness of both sexes, or you're just going to go nowhere. If you're just going to continue to blame one side, the problem's going to continue. So he said, I'm going to spend an hour and a half explaining this to you from every conceivable angle. There's no way that at the end of this you could disagree. It's impossible. I've proved it. And yet you will. I hope I can find his name. That Senate hearing committee was available, but it's been memory hold. In the Gulag Archipelago, Alexander Solzhenitsyn remarks that Shakespeare's evildoers, Macbeth notably among them, stop short at a mere dozen corpses because they have no ideology. This is a nom de plume, Theodore Dalrymple. Really an amazing guy. He had a penchant for traveling around the world to the most dangerous places and seeing, just how much danger and trouble he could get into. Wrote a lot about that. And then worked as a prison psychiatrist and a psychiatrist in a mental health facility. And he makes a very good argument. You could look at the interview that he did with Jordan Peterson. It's Theodore Dalrymple, Dalrymple. And from his experience, he can say, if we can't get people to reproduce responsibly, well, the streets are going to be filled with crime, the prisons are going to be full, and that's the way it's going to go. Uh, Children need a mother and a father. Just ask a child, would they rather have a mother and a father? Um, Look at the quote again. And this is relevant to all ideologies, not just feminism. But listen to this. In the Gulag Archipelago, Alexander Solzhenitsyn remarks that Shakespeare's evildoers, Macbeth notable among them, stop short at a mere dozen corpses because they have no ideology. If you want to see evil from people, give them an ideology. And yes, I do mean that. Feminists and the wokies are nothing if not ideological. There can be no greater pleasure in life, Stalin is reputed to have said, than to choose one's enemy, inflict a terrible revenge on him, and go quietly to bed. He might have added, if he really did say this, secure in the knowledge that one has done good. Committing evil for goodness' sake must surely rank as an even greater pleasure than Stalin's. It satisfies the inner sadist and the inner moralist at the same time. That's what we're looking at. People whose inner sadist and inner moralists are being satisfied at the same time. I believe that to be Theodore Dalrymple as well. I've always understood that the basis of all civilization is the family. From 1971 and even before with the Marxist movement held that the family is a dangerous place for women and children and that men need to be disenfranchised from it. We're tearing away at the fabric of our civilization. That's Aaron Pizzey. Aaron Pizzey opened the world's first women's shelter. I think it would have been the late 60s in England. And she saw the need for it. And so she did it, right? She did that work to create that. And it took a few years and she started to realize, well, you know what? I'm coming across a lot of men that need some sort of shelter as well. They're living with horribly abusive wives and they might not have that much money. They might be psychologically damaged. They need some help as well. And so she moved to either allow men into that same facility or to create new ones. I would imagine it would be to create new ones. And she was shut down, absolutely shut down. And what she said was that by pursuing this idea that men were horribly violent and responsible for all of the evil in the world and that kind of thing, that there was a great deal of money to be made. That was one thing. And the other thing is that it would help them to destroy the civilization, really. Because if you want to install an authoritarian government, you first have to destroy the civilization. If people can rely on their family, their sense of pride, their sense of history, a good grounding in critical thinking, you can't dominate them. And so those are the things that have to be destroyed in order for authoritarians to take control. The purpose of those who argue for cultural diversity is to impose ideological uniformity. And that's Theodore Dalrymple again. It's common knowledge, obviously, but well said, I thought. I think the term authoritarian is thrown around quite a lot without people appreciating it fully, the evil that it represents. Ultimately, it's about enslavement, imprisonment, torture, and murder, sometimes on a mass scale. Surely, though, you can't be suggesting that the wokies are that cruel. But judging by what they do, it is clear that they're headed in that direction. If they push someone out of a hard-won career for voicing a wrong opinion, you push him into poverty, and poverty can be deadly. If you take a man's house and children, you torture his soul. Constantly denigrate his culture, deprive him of equal opportunity. Consistently do this? Yeah, I think they have the capacity for anything. Okay, I'll leave it at that.